So I listen to a lot of podcasts, probably a lot more than the average person. I probably listen to about 20 hours of podcasts every single week just because of the nature of my job, because I drive for a living, so really I just need something to fill my time. But because of that, I go through dozens and dozens of different podcasts, and when I find one that I like, I go all the way through the archives and listen to it from the beginning. But I will always find ones that I'll return to, and I'll listen to the entire archive, and then I'll go back to the beginning and listen to more. For lack of a better term, they're my favorites. But a couple years ago, I made a video talking about my top 10 favorite podcasts, and over the years, they've changed. And I don't really want to talk about what are my favorite podcasts now, or at least title it that way, because it's ever changing. But what I did want to do is talk about the 9 podcasts that got me through 2022 and the ones that I listen to the most. 9 because I'm going to talk about 3 very specific subgenres of podcasts and 3 podcasts within those subgenres that I very specifically like. The first subgenre I want to talk about is podcasts run by YouTubers or popularized by YouTube personalities. The second one I want to talk about is like TV show recaps. I love movies and TV shows, as is obvious if you've seen my YouTube channel and anything I talk about. So it stands to reason that I'd love just listening to people talk about a TV show for an hour and a half per episode. And the third is just titled The Ringer, because The Ringer podcast network on Spotify, who, even though it sounds like I'm running an ad for them, I'm not. I just think they put out phenomenal podcasts, has dozens and dozens of different podcasts that are all really well produced and just run by amazing people out there. But I want to talk about the 3 that stand out to me that I listened to the most last year. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So these are absolutely in no particular order, but I'm going to start with YouTube podcasts, and the first one I'm going to talk about is Dear Hank and John.
Hello, and welcome to Dear Hank and John.
Or as I prefer to think of it, Dear John and Hank.
It's a comedy podcast where 2 brothers answer your questions, give you dubious advice, and bring you all the week's news from both Mars and AFC Wimbledon.
Now, if I was talking about my all-time favorite podcasts, I'm going to be 100% honest, no matter what year, Dear Hank and John would be number 1. It's run by John and Hank Green, of the Vlogbrothers fame, of VidCon fame, of Crash Course fame, just veterans of the internet and absolutely huge names when it comes to books and science and YouTube and podcast and everything out there. I'm pretty sure there's nobody on a corner of the internet that doesn't know these legends. And honestly, they've been huge role models and inspirations to me my entire life, especially John Green. I have the vast majority of his book collection behind me. The very first book that I ever wrote has DFTBA written in it in the author's note, which is Don't Forget to Be Awesome, the saying of the Vlogbrothers community known as Nerdfighteria. And this podcast run by them is just a standard question and answer podcast where they answer questions sent in by listeners, and at the end of it they talk about news from Mars and news from AFC Wimbledon, a 4th-tier English soccer club, and also my favorite soccer club, kind of honestly only because of this fandom that introduced me to them and began my obsession with the team. It's just a really good listen. They obviously have great chemistry because they're brothers, and they've been working together in a creative capacity because of Vlogbrothers for 16 years now on YouTube, 15 years of which I've been watching them. And even though they only post like 4-minute videos twice a week on YouTube, once a week on Monday, getting to listen to them for 45 minutes is awesome. So the first podcast that got me through 2022 is Dear Hank and John. Number 2 is a complete opposite side of the spectrum when it comes to YouTuber podcasts, and that is The Yard, ran by Ludwig and his friends Slime, Aiden, and Nick.
I met a guy named Hunter today.
Hunter!
Mm-hmm.
Shouts out.
Yeah, and a guy named Haywood, too.
Haywood.
Hey, with his dick fit in your mouth?
Oh, I was going to say
oh,
it.
Shit.
I was going to say it, but no, you came in clutch.
This is probably the most, how do I put it? Crass podcast just makes me sound like a fucking dweeb when I say it. But I'm going to say podcast that I would not be comfortable listening to around almost any other human being in existence. In fact, when I get up to stoplights, I make sure to turn this down just in case anybody is walking by and hears it in my car, because the fucked up things they talk about are absolutely insane. There's a couple episodes where they talk about the CEO of YouTube, Susan Wojcicki, having intercourse with a dog named Bruce. It's a weird podcast, but being 4 best friends, they have great chemistry. Ludwig is one of my favorite YouTubers. They're kind of douchey assholes, but in a very charismatic and fun way. And if I'm being 100% honest, this podcast has the most parasocial energy to it, to where you listen to this and it just kind of feels like plopping yourself down in a conversation with 4 buddies. So it's just a really easy way to pass an hour and a half. Number 3, and the last one in this YouTuber subgenre, is Distractible, run by Mark, Bob, and Wade.
Good evening, gentle listener, and welcome to Distractible, a Wood Elf production. This week, Bob gives copious convincing head, but oddly doesn't like fluffers, sneeman, or ball bashing. World Supreme Wade has prissy digits and likes soft things, not hard boners in his mouth. Mark opens the Urban Dictionary and drops a failed college dating story and develops breast milk ice cream. Yes, it's time for the ick. Now sit back and prepare to be distracted and enjoy the show.
Mark, otherwise known as Markiplier, one of the biggest names on all of YouTube. And although nowadays I don't really watch Markiplier's content all that much, it's very much the same feeling in this podcast as The Yard, which is just, it's nice to listen to 3 friends absolutely just bullshit, and to where this podcast used to have kind of a structure to it, to where there was a point system and one of them would host and 2 of them would compete to host the next episode. They still do that, but anymore there's not really a structure to it whatsoever. They're just kind of, they give each other a prompt at the beginning of the podcast and they just bullshit and go on tangents and, like the title says, become distracted. Going into the second subgenre, TV show recaps, I want to talk about a podcast that's honestly not even on the air anymore, but I still listen to some of my favorite episodes all the time just because of how good it is and the inside connection that they have with the actual show and the characters and actors on there itself, and that is West Wing Weekly with Rishikesh Hirway and Joshua Malina. Like I said, this is one of my all-time favorite recaps because it's really one of the first podcasts out there doing like a recap of a TV show on a week-to-week basis that actually had one of the stars with Joshua Malina, who wasn't exactly one of the main stars. But he was definitely a star later on in the series, had a star on the show, so he had an inside connection with people on the show. And in the finale of West Wing Weekly, they had it live, and they actually had like everybody that was on the TV show on stage together doing this live, including Aaron Sorkin. So this was an immense big deal, and it kind of paved the way for the other 2 that I'm going to talk about on this, which then brings me to number 5, Parks and Recollection.
Getting together to talk about all the things we used to do. The laughs, the passions, the little Sebastians, the pits we fell into. And we're putting it all in a podcast. Then we'll send it up into the sky. We're calling it Parks and Recollection. Come on, little podcast, spread your wings and fly.
Which is run by Alan Yang and Rob Lowe. Alan Yang, who was a writer on Parks and Rec, and Rob Lowe, who was obviously an actor on Parks and Rec. And this is obviously very much possible because of what the West Wing Weekly did for them. Parks and Recreation is my all-time favorite TV show. I made a video just talking about how the finale of Parks and Rec is the best finale ever made in the history. No questions asked. If you don't believe me and you don't agree with me, fuck you, you're wrong. But everybody's, justified in their own opinion. But just like the West Wing Weekly, this podcast has so many inside tracks to people within the show. They have so many great stories. And a lot of the time with Rob Lowe, he goes on weird tangents where he talks about his messed up childhood. And one time he just talks about doing whippets with Charlie Sheen. And then after like 10 minutes of talking about that, he kind of just is like, wait, what were we talking about? And then they go back to the show. So having Rob Lowe on this, who honestly kind of seems like the kind of guy that would think doing a podcast is beneath him, but he's super fun to listen to. And then Alan Yang's stories about them being in the writer's room and bullshitting is a lot of fun. I highly recommend this podcast to anybody that's a big fan. They're on a break right now, but I'm sure they'll be coming back soon. And then last on this is Avatar Braving the Elements.
Hey friends, I'm Janet Varney and I was the voice of Korra on The Legend of Korra.
And I'm Dante Bosco, the voice of Zuko on The Last Airbender and General Iroh on The Legend of Korra.
And we're your hosts for Braving the Elements, Nickelodeon's podcast celebrating all things Avatarverse.
Which probably has the most star-studded lineup for the host, which is Jeanette Varney, who played Korra in The Legend of Korra, and Dante Bosco, who played Zuko in Avatar The Last Airbender. Probably the two biggest stars in each one of those, and the two most loved actors and voice actors within the two of those shows coming together in this to break down not only every single episode, but the behind the scenes, and talk to the directors and talk to the creators and talk to the other actors within this. Out of all of these, even the West Wing Weekly, which started it all and had that big blowout at the finale, this one has the most in-depth breakdowns and behind the scenes and just a lot of fun talking to all these people. Like, if you're a fan of Avatar, you can get nothing better than this podcast. Like, seriously. And the final little subgenre I want to talk about is The Ringer, the whole damn podcast network. And I'm calling that a subgenre because it seems like at this point, a third of all podcasts made are by The Ringer anyway. And number 7 that I want to talk about is The Big Picture, run by Sean Fennessy and Amanda Dobbins.
I'm Sean Fennessy.
I'm Amanda Dobbins.
And this is The Big Picture, a conversation show about the man, the myth, the legend, Brad Pitt, who is perhaps our greatest living movie star.
And Sean Fennessy is, honestly, if I was to really think about who is the best podcaster in the world, I'd have to say Sean Fennessy. He is an absolutely brilliant podcaster. He's got the voice for it. He's got the attitude for it. He's got the charisma for it. Amanda Dobbins is really good and bounces off him very well. Sometimes I have a little bit of problems with her and the way she sees nerd culture and the gaming community and things like that, but that's okay. The Big Picture talks about all the big movies and actors that are coming out now. And I used to be in a place to where I'd watch 2 to 3 movies in the movie theater every single week. 2015 and 16, I probably saw every single movie that came out that year. But as I've gotten older and I've gotten married, I've had kids, I'm not able to see many movies. Besides Marvel movies, last year, I probably saw 5 movies. So The Big Picture, for somebody that loves film the way I do and used to call themselves a bit of a film snob and a movie buff, keeping up with it with The Big Picture is super nice, and without them, I'd be completely out of the loop on what was going on. Number 8 is The Rewatchables, run by Bill Simmons, who is the founder and CEO of The Ringer.
All he's doing is like trying to get a job.
You have different accents? You did, you little fucking snake. You have different accents? You did, didn't you, you little fucking snake? You were like different people.
It's just so good. Wahlberg's really good.
And although he's most prominently known for his sports podcasts being huge in the entire sports industry, his show, The Rewatchables, that he does, where he takes a movie that, like the title says, is extremely, extremely rewatchable and breaks it down with guest stars a lot of the time, including Sean Evans and Chris Ryan, also of The Ringer. Chris Ryan, who runs The Watch. It's a lot of fun, and it's an absolute blast. I'm not able to listen to every single episode because it's not as if I've seen every single one of these movies, but the ones that I do listen to, I've actually listened to a couple times. The Martian episode, one of my all-time favorite episodes. And finally, number 9 is the Ringerverse.
Detective Bernice, you labeled Elrond Detective Elrond in our Rings of Power finale chat, and it's sticking. So we're here with Detective Bernice now. Immediately sniffs out. Oh, you're doing a coup.
You doing a coup? Oh, you should just say
You're doing a coup. Boy.
And the Ringerverse at this point, honestly, is like 3 separate podcasts. You got the Midnight Boys, you got House of R, and you got Mint Edition. And with the Midnight Boys, you get instant reaction recaps of trailers and movies and TV shows right after they come out, dropping like right after midnight. And then with House of R, you get super like insane deep dives into nerd culture things. Like when the Spider-Man trailer for No Way Home came out, they did an 1.5-hour deep dive on it. For every single episode of House of the Dragon, they did like 2 hours on it. It's absolutely insane. Mallory Rubin, Johanna Robinson are my favorite people in all of podcasting. And then in Mint Edition, you get the guys talking about the smaller things. It's a periodic podcast within a podcast where they talk about things like Arcane and the DC animated movies on HBO that nobody's talked about. And they're just little things that we missed, like recapping all of the Halo show. Ringerverse is easily my most listened to podcast of all of 2022 because I watched all the movies that came out and I watched all the shows that came out that they talked about. And I'd probably listen to, 3 of their podcasts every single week. In the time when all the Marvel shows were releasing, listening to them talk about it on The Midnight Boys one day and then House of R 3 days later was fucking phenomenal. The best time this entire year for me, as far as media is concerned, is when House of the Dragon came out, and I had like 5 hours of podcasts to listen to just by those guys. They're amazing. I love them. Ringerverse is far and away my most listened to podcast ever. Like, honestly. But thank you for watching. I know this is kind of an out of ordinary video. I don't know how many people are going to be interested in me just blabbing about podcasts. But I consume more podcasts than I do any other entertainment out there, honestly. More than TV shows, more than movies, far more than video games. So it makes a sense that I talk about it every now and then. But I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and check out my other videos.